What's going on, guys? Welcome to You Suck at Coding. This is the part 2 of the 3-part tutorial series MERN Authentication, and in this video we'll be setting up the backend. So let's get started. Alright, so let's go and expand the folder server. It already has some subfolders that we've created, and if I go to the app.js file, we already have the server and the database set up. So if you want to learn how to set up a MERN stack project from scratch and get up to this point, you could follow along to one of my previous tutorials, the link of which is at the top right now and in the description. So let's get started and fire up the terminal. Let's do Command J. So we'll do an npm start, which in the backs of it is basically NodeMon app.js that we have already set up. So it says server is connected on port 8080 and also DB connected. Awesome. So we'll go ahead and install some of the additional packages that we'll be needing for the authentication. So I'll open up another terminal. So we'll do an npm I and install the package cookie parser, crypto for hashing, to Express Validator, and for this one we'll be installing the version 5.3.1, and then we'll also be needing JSON web token and a nice little package UUID v1. So let's install these and go to package.json, see if they are installed. Perfect. So the next step now would be to go to the models directory and create a file, a collection for users. And inside of that, we'll be defining the user schema, which is the blueprint for the collection. So we need Mongoose. So let's import Mongoose. Also UUID v1 and crypto. Const user schema equal to new Mongoose schema, brackets, do curly brackets, and to it I will pass on the fields that I want. So we want the user collection, the user table, as you can say in SQL, to have the field username, email, and the password, but not exactly the password, a hashed version of it. So for that, let's go ahead and start defining the username. So inside of the username object, I can pass all of the properties that I want this to have. So I want this to be a type of string. I want this to be a mandatory, so I'll pass required true. Let's trim this so that if there's any white spaces, we can get rid of those. Every username should be a unique one, so a unique true. Also, we want the username to be lowercase at all times. So let's do a lowercase true. And we want all of these properties to also be part of the field email. So I'm just going to simply copy and paste those. Perfect. So the password is going to be saved as a hashed password. So let's do a hashed password. This would be again a type string and a required field. So let's do that. We'll be using salt to create the hash password. Let's do salt, and this should be a string. Perfect. We also want, like every document in the user collection, to have a timestamp, the MongoDB Mongoose timestamps, which is created at and updated at. So for that, let's do timestamps true. Okay, that's fine. So in order to complete this schema, we'll go at the bottom and do a module.exports is equal to mongoose.model, set capitalized user, and pass the schema that we just created. So this creates the schema, but in order to create the hashed password, we'll also be doing some additional things in the schema. The first of which would be to create the virtual password field. So I'll add a comment called virtual field, and to this, let's do the user schema dot virtual method, pass it the string password, and chain a set method, which is going to have a function. Let's do a function, an argument password, and inside of this, let's add some comments in code. So we want to create a temporary variable called underscore password. Let's do this dot underscore password is equal to password. So we'll be using the package UUID to generate a timestamp, which is basically the salt that we'll be using for hashing. Gives us the Unix timestamp. Perfect. So let's do this dot salt is equal to executing the package. Now we want to encrypt the password function call. For that, let's do this dot hashed password is equal to this dot encrypt password, add password as an argument. So this is a method that we are yet to create. So for that, let's add a comment called methods, do a user schema dot methods is equal to first encrypt password, set a function, then argument of password, and what this is going to do is first of all check if the password exists. In case it doesn't, this just returns an empty string. So if it's not empty, let's add a try catch. It's just to return empty string again for the catch. So inside of the try, what I'm going to do is to return using the package crypto, create an HMAC with algorithm SHA256 and also pass it salt. I'll change the method update to which we'll add the password, and also do a dot digest, pass it keyword hex. Awesome. So we have the encrypt password method set up. We also want an authenticate when the user is trying to log in. So for that, let's do authenticate the function, and the user will be entering their password as plain text. Every time they do that, we'll encrypt their password with this dot encrypt password and compare that to the stored hashed password field. Now if it's true, it will give true. If it's false, they won't be getting the access. So that is about it for the user collection. We have that set up. The next step would be, which is actually something that we should have done before this, is to import the packages in the app.js file. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll be adding some of them at the end. So let's do a const cookie parser require from the package cookie -parser. Let's do a const for Express Validator. Right. Let's also go ahead and destructure JSON and URL encoded from Express. Okay, so we'll add these to the middlewares. Let me go over here. Let's start with app.use for JSON. Let's add app.use URL encoded, pass it an object with property extended false. Okay, so let's add app.use for the cookie parser. And the last one would be for the Express Validator. Perfect. So next step would be to go ahead and create a route. So inside of the route directory, I'll create a file user.js, and inside of that file, we'll go ahead and create some routes. So the first step would be to again import Express, create a router from Express. Const router is equal to Express dot capital R router. Now let's add some comments. To be import controllers, import any middlewares, and finally API route. So let's do a router.post. It will be a post request /register, and we'll be adding the controller, not over here. We'll be creating it inside the controller, but for now Let's just add this so that it doesn't break our code. And at the end of the file, I'll do a module dot exports is equal to router. All right, that's all good. So what we'll do now is go ahead and create that controller, which will be importing from this directory. So let's go ahead and create another file, call it user.js. Inside of that file, for now, let's just create a body, call it exports.register is equal to argument request response. And that should be good enough for now. Let's go ahead and replace that. Let's import it first. So we'll do a const register is equal to require from the directory controllers and file user. Place this over here. We'll also need to add user routes to the app.js file after the middlewares. Let's go ahead and do that. Do a const user routes is equals require. So we'll get the routes from the user file, and we'll do an app.use with a slash and all of these routes. So they should be accessible now from the app.js file. Anything we create over here. The next step would be to go ahead and create an actual controller. So for that, let's go to the user.js inside of the controllers. Let's do const user is equal to requires models from the file user. All right, so let's go ahead and create the controller. We'll be adding some comments. So let's check if user already exists. If the user does, we'll give them an error message. So for that, let's do a const username exists. So we check. So we want this to be asynchronous. So let's add async await user.find1. So if the user is found using the username, which we can access from request.body.username, will have this username exist constant populated. Similarly, for the email, it will be populated, and now we'll check for these. So we'll say that if username exists, it's true. We'll return an error response.status 3.json. So we'll also an error username is taken, and similarly for the email, to if email exists, give them an error that email is taken. So if none of those conditions are true, we'll go ahead and save the newly created user. So if new user, create a new user. Right, so we'll do const user to new user collection, pass it the request.body, and do that. We'll do an await user.save, and that should create the new user. Once that is done, we want to send a response with a status code of 201 and a JSON message saying that signup is successful. Please log in to proceed. Perfect. So that is the register controller. In order to test this API, we'll be using an application called Postman. Okay, so let me go ahead and switch to that. So inside of the Postman right now, I've already gone ahead and created a collection called MERN Auth so that it saves all of the API requests that I'm making. So I'll add a request to it. By default, it gives us a GET request. I want to create a post for the register. So let's add the URL first, which is http localhost 8080/register. Perfect. We'll also be needing to pass a body. So we'll go inside of body, select raw, change from text to JSON, and create the JSON form. So it'll contain the username. Let's go with Bob. The email, let's go with bob@bob.com. Bob's famous. And for the password, let's keep it simple, do a 1 2 3 4 5 6. So now let's go ahead and press send and see what happens. Perfect. It gives us a message saying the signup is successful, please log in to proceed. So now if I go ahead into my MongoDB Atlas portal, it should give me a collection user, and inside of the collection a document for Bob. So let's refresh this. We have the users collection, and we also have a document with Bob. It has the username, the email, and if we have a closer look, you'll see that it has stored the hash password and the salt and also the timestamps. So we don't have the user's password saved anywhere in the database, which is what we want. Perfect. But there is a problem with this one. As you saw that the user was able to pass on 1 2 3 4 5 6 as the password. They could have also gone ahead and created an email which is not actually an email. It could just be a simple string, and the backend would have accepted it. So the idea is to add validation so that if there's any field which is not legitimate, it should give them an error message. And for that, we'll be using Express Validator. So let's go ahead and add a middleware to our already existing Register API. We'll be creating a file again called user.js inside of the folder middlewares. We'll do an exports.user register validator. Let's keep camel case. And since this one is a middleware, it needs to have another parameter called next, so that it moves on to the controller once it is done. So inside of this function, this middleware function, we'll first of all check if the username is not null. So let's go ahead, I'll add a comment for clarity, username is not null. So we'll add request.check. Inside of check, I'll pass a string, username, because we're looking for that field, and we want to see if it's empty or not. So we'll chain a method dot not empty. So if it is empty, we want to pass a message, and that message, we can have anything as that message. Let's go with username is required. Okay, so similarly, let's go and do this for the email. We'll check if email is not null, valid, and normalized. So let's do a request.check. Go ahead. Email is required if it's empty. Let's do another request.check for email, and this time we'll check using a method called isEmail. And if it's not an email, they should have a message called invalid email. Perfect. And now we'll go ahead and add some validations for the password. So we'll do a request.check for the password, and again password is required. And now another request.check, and this one is going to be for the length of the password. Password.isLength. So pass it an object with minimum of 6. So if it's not a minimum of 6, the message can be passed saying password must contain at least 6 characters. Awesome. So we also want the password to have at least one number, one lowercase, one uppercase character, and a special symbol. And for that, we'll be creating a request.check, another one for password, and to that we'll add a .matches method and pass a regular expression that is going to check for all of the conditions that I just mentioned. And here it is. Let me paste that, it's a big one. So this also accounts for the minimum length, but it's okay to have it twice. It doesn't really matter. We could go ahead and delete this, but let's just keep it. It's fine. And the message that we want to be displayed with this error is going to say password must contain, let's go with all of them, so at least 6 characters, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 number, and 1 special symbol. Right. So if this message is displayed, the validation is already passed this check, so we can go ahead and actually delete this part of it. Must contain at least 6 characters. Let's go ahead and delete this and keep it till here. Perfect. So we have all the checks. The next step would be to see if there's any errors. So we'll check for any errors. For that, let's do const errors is equal to request dot validation errors. So what is going to happen now is if there's an error, we want to show the first one as it happens, because there can be many, right? So we'll do an if errors. Let's do a const, call it first error is equals errors dot map. We'll map through all of the errors that we have, and what we want is to display the first one, the message for first one. So we'll add an index of 0 with it, and we want this to be returned. So we'll do a response dot status. Let's do a code of 400 dot JSON. We'll add an error message which is equivalent to the first error. And since, like I said before, this is a middleware, we want this to proceed to the next middleware, which could be a controller. So let's do proceed to next middleware. So that will call the next method. All right, so we have this validation created now. Okay, so the last step in this process would be to go to the routes user.js, import this middleware, so const user register validator. That's a heavy name. Get this from the directory middlewares file users and add this right below the register. So let's do user register validator, and then it will go to the register controller. So let's test it out in Postman now. So I'll just go ahead and create send again and see if the username and email checks work. So I'll go press send. It says error, password must contain 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 number, and 1 special symbol. So as we know that the validator, the middleware user register validator, is running before of the controller method, which checks whether the username or email has been taken. So the first thing it does is that gives us this error for the 1 2 3 4 5 6. If I change this to 5, it will simply give me the message for password must contain at least 6 characters. Okay, let's go ahead and change this to MUST instead of MUS. My bad. Let's press this again. It says password must contain at least 6 characters. So that's all good. Now let's go ahead and create a password that follows all of the requirements and see what happens if we use the same username and email. Oh, it says username is taken. All right, so let's do a bob2 with the same email. It now says email is taken. Perfect. So if we go ahead and change it to, let's say, something like Harry, Harry @harry.com and press send. It says sign up successful, please log in to proceed. Awesome. So if we go ahead to the MongoDB collection now, refresh this and see we have Harry, another user added. So that is it for the registration API. We'll be moving on to the login API next. Start by creating the login controller, and for that the first step would be to go ahead and import some of the packages like JWT and .env. So I'll do that. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a login controller. Sports.login async request response, and let's get started. So first we'll find the user based on the email that is provided in the login form. So let's do a const. We'll get the email and the password using destructuring from request.body, and next we'll do an await user.find1 using the email. Execute this query, from which we'll get either an error or the user. So let's do an arrow function. So let's say that if error or no user is found, error or no user, then we'll return an error. So response status 401.json will say error being invalid credentials. Alright, so now if a user is found, so let's say if user is found, we use the authenticate method from the models. Say that if not of user.authenticate password, which means that if the password is incorrect, we'll again return an error. Response status 401 and a message invalid email or password. Let's make this capitalized. That's good. So in case either of these if statements do not work, what we'll do is generate a token with user's ID and the JWT secret. So now we'll go ahead and create a JWT secret. It's a good practice to add this to the .env file so that it's not uploaded to any of your Git repositories if you're doing that. So I'll go to the .env file, and let me just go ahead, get at the bottom, and I'll add JWT_secret. It should be of like a good size and length and should be alphanumeric, but for this one we'll just keep it simple and call it something cool like I am Iron Man. That should be fine. Alright, so inside of the user.js file now, we'll go ahead and do as the comment says. We'll do a const token is equal to jwt.sign, and in the options do an ID which is equal to the user ID, which we'll be using to create the JWT token. User ID, and we'll also be passing the JWT secret, which is process.env JWT_secret. Alright, and if we want this to be expired in a certain amount of time, we'll pass another object, and inside of that object I'll pass expires in, and in strings I can do 24h, which is 24 hours. Perfect. So now that the token is generated, you want to persist the token as JWT in cookie with an expiry date. For that, we'll do a response.cookie, save it as JWT inside of the browser, pass the token, and we'll do an expire with today's date plus, let's say, 9999, that's fine. And we also want this token to not be accessible in the front end using JavaScript in the browser. So we'll make an HTTP only, which is a good practice. So that's all good. And the next step would be to return the response with the user. So let's get the username from the user. All right, let's return response.json, the message that says login successful. And let's also pass the username. Should be fine. So that's our login controller. Let's go ahead to the route and add this over there. So I'm going to import the login controller from here, create another post route. Let's do router.post login, and this should be good enough. So let's go to Postman and test this out. Alright, so we're here at the Postman. I've already created a new request. Let's make this one a post again. Add the URL localhost 8080/login, and this time we go to body, and instead of the username, email and password, we'll just do an email and password. Let's do email. We want to log in as Harry. And what was Harry's password? If I'm not wrong, it was QWERTY1 an exclamation. Alright, so let's press send and see what happens. Awesome, it says message login successful, username Harry. And if I go into the cookies now, it has 1, and it shows me the token, which is JWT, and it has this value that we'll see in the browser once we integrate this with our front end. So that was the login API, and now we'll be moving on to logout. So for the Logout API, it's actually very simple. All we need to do is just remove the cookie from the browser. So I'll do exports logout. This is going to be a GET request. So we'll just say clear the cookie. With that, let's do a response dot clear cookie, pass the name, which is JWT, and then we'll also provide a response with a message saying logout successful. Let's go ahead and add that to the routes. So I'll do a router.get/logout, and to this pass the logout controller. Just go ahead and do that. Logout. That's it. Let's go ahead and test it in Postman. So from the Postman, what I'm going to do now is simply change this to the logout, because we need the cookie in order to log out. So change this to logout. The body is going to be ignored since this is a GET request, and let's see what happens. So you see that the cookie is cleared, and if I go to body, it says message logout successful. Awesome. So we have the Logout API created, and now the only API that is left is to get the logged in user. So let's get started with that. So after logging in, for any of the features or APIs the user is accessing, we want to have two middlewares that first verify that the token is still valid and available inside of the user's browser, and that the user exists. So for that, we'll get started first by creating two middlewares. So let's go inside of the middlewares directory and create a file and call it auth.js. Inside of the auth.js, let's do const jwt and import this. All right. So what we want is to verify the user's token. So let's write exports.verify token. And since this is a middleware, it's going to have request, response, and next as parameters. Let's do let access token and get the token from the request. So request.cookies.jwt, which is the name of the token. So we'll see that if there is no token in the cookies, the request is unauthorized. So we check if not access token, that means that it's falsy, it doesn't exist. So we return a response with status of 4 or 3 and a message says unauthorized. Alright, let's do payload, find a variable, go inside of try catch. For the catch part, we'll again do the same thing, return the request unauthorized error. Return response.status 403.json unauthorized. Alright, so inside of try now, when it's not unauthorized, we verify the token using jwt.verify. So this throws an error if token has expired or has an invalid signature. Right, so we'll do payload, and this is equal to jwt.verify. We'll pass the access token and we'll pass this process.env.jwt-secret. So this will verify if the token is still valid, and if it is, it will pass the user's ID to the payload, which we can access and add to the request. So let's do request._id is equal to payload._id. Alright, and after that we can go ahead and go on to the next middleware. So the next middleware for this one is going to be inside of the user.js file, which is called user by ID, which is to simply access the user and pass it to the request. So let's do an exports dot user by ID request response next as usual. So we'll do a user dot find by ID, pass it the request dot underscore ID that we just got from the previous middleware, execute this, and again get the error or the user. So we'll say that if there's an error or the user does not exist, let's respond with the status of 400 and an error message that says user not found. So let's actually change the status code to 404, which is for not found, and now we'll add the user object in request with all user info. So let's do that. We'll do request.user is equal to user so that it's accessible everywhere after that, and do a next. Now we'll go to user.js and write that last controller to exports dot, let's call it get logged in user, and all it's going to do is get the username, because if we're reached till this point, we already know that the user is valid and is logged in. So we get the username and we return a response status of 200, and we add a message. Let's say user is still logged in, and also the username. So now what we'll do is go to the routes, user.js, get the controller, get logged in user, from the user middleware get user by ID, and also get the middleware called verify token from the auth middlewares. Should be middlewares and auth file. So for this one, we'll do router.get again. Let's call it /user. So first we'll add the verify token middleware. So if the token is verified, it'll move on and get the user by its ID. And once that is done, the API that we're looking for here is get logged in user. So let's go ahead and test it in Postman now. Okay, so inside of the Postman, I'm going to log in real quick. Change this to login and post so that we have the cookie. And now I'm going to change this again back to get and /user to get the logged in user. Press send. Right, it's probably an error. See what it is. It says /login. The user is not defined. So I think I get it. So inside of the file middleware's user.js, we accessed the collection user, but we forgot to import it. So I'm going to do that real quickly. Let's do a const user is equal to acquire models and user file. Let's press send again. Perfect. So it says message user is still logged in, and it gives us the username, which is Harry. And that was about it for the get logged in user, which was our last API. Alright guys, so this concludes the part 2 with the backend of the 3-part tutorial series MERN Authentication. In the next part, we'll be integrating this back into the frontend that we created in the part 1 and add some final and finishing touches to it. If you enjoyed watching the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. This is Banish at You Suck at Coding. Until next time.